I'll begin with just noting this is the first anniversary of Evgeny Prizogin's death. You remember him, Wagner, the march on Moscow in June 2023. And then, I mean, I can remember writing a commentary on that march and saying to him, Evgeny, be careful that, you know, when you're in a building, make sure it's on the first floor. Don't go anywhere high. I was the last to predict that he would get blown out of the sky. But yes, it's a frequent occurrence, isn't it, for anyone who crosses Vladimir Putin, that they end up dead. But of course, there were, as you would expect at the time, those on the pro-Kremlin left that said that this Wagner coup was a brilliant move because it would allow Putin to centralize the military and get rid of Wagner. And my own take on it was that this wasn't a brilliant move, but actually a sign of the weakness of the regime. And I have the same reaction to the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. This is August the 7th. I have to say that I'm still in a position, as I said in this week's article, that I'm completely in the dark when it comes to how on earth Ukrainian forces so easily penetrated Russian defenses. I thought for a moment, am I mistaken? Have I been writing, you know, over all of these months about Russia digging, dragon's teeth, you know, tank traps, minefields, kill zones, and all the rest of it, not only along the 1,000-kilometer hot front between Ukrainian and Russian forces inside Ukraine, but also I've been making the point that these defenses run all the way up the internationally recognized border separating Ukraine and Russia, all the way up the east and all the way along the north. So I thought to myself for one moment, you know, that am I mistaken here? Anyway, I consulted various, you know, what you'd call credible websites, and no, there they are on the maps. This is from satellite images. Two lines of Russian defenses in terms of Kursk, one directly on the border, one further back. Now, of course, what these two lines of defenses are, they're actually behind Ukrainian lines. And again, as I mentioned in this week's article in the Weekly Worker, there are adverts in the Russian media calling upon workers who want to risk their lives for, I don't know how many rubles, but not much in the way of dollars. I don't know how that counts in Russia. Yeah, go out there and dig trenches in Kursk. And indeed, there are now satellite images with the new lines of defenses. And my understanding is that similar moves are being made in the Ukrainian side to dig. So it looks at least like to me that what we've got is another front in this war. It looks like it isn't going to be simply in and out, as has been the case with, you know, anti-Kremlin Russian forces based in Ukraine. They've made incursions into other oblasts. So it seems to me that this is going to be something in the way of an occupation. It would seem to me that we'd be very soon into, back into static warfare. So why did Zelensky give the go-ahead? Well, one, I think it's about propaganda. It's about showing that the Putin FSB regime in Moscow is vulnerable, that it cannot protect Russian lands. I think it was also an attempt to divert Russian forces from what I'll call the Eastern Front, where Russian forces have been making steady, although painfully slow and hugely costly advances throughout the summer. There's no sign at the moment that their advances, slow though they are, have stopped. Although there is evidence of them bringing in new forces into Kursk. Okay. Now, reading the Financial Times, we're assured that this particular operation in Kursk was the result of close consultations between only a few people. And I'm not convinced that this didn't involve Western advisors. The Financial Times says that they weren't involved, but I have to say that they would say that, wouldn't they? I.e., the Ukrainian side is not going to boast about Western advisors, and I suppose the West isn't going to boast about actually encouraging Ukrainian attack on Russian soil. So what to make of this incursion? I think there's a third factor which we also ought to mention, and that is of course dependent on the election in the United States in November. I mean, I haven't got a clue who's going to win, other than it's most likely going to be Kamala Harris or it's going to be Donald Trump. I think I'm on a pretty safe bet there. But I do think that Zelensky, looking at the situation in the United States, is saying, yes, Trump could win and Trump could try. I don't think he will succeed myself in negotiating a peace deal within 48 hours. But nonetheless, having a situation of where it isn't only Russian forces that are in control of Ukrainian land, having a situation of where Ukrainian forces are also in control of Russian land, then perhaps we could do a deal. Perhaps we could trade land for land, POWs for POWs. Who knows? But I do think that that at least is a third factor to consider. And indeed, we've just had in Kiev, Modi, the Prime Minister of India, having given Vladimir a bear hug, he's gone on to give Vladimir a bear hug as well. And India seems to be putting itself forward as an honest broker. There's been some trade deals, there's been some agreement to deliver, Indian aid, humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But at the same time, we've had a demonstration that India remains close to Russia. That's been a historic ally. If you look at the Indian military, overwhelmingly, it's supplied with Russian gear. So India could put itself forward as a neutral under these circumstances, where clearly the United States can't, Europe can't. And indeed, it's worth noting, isn't it, that India did attend the Swiss peace conference organized by Ukraine, but didn't sign up to the final declaration. The declaration that Modi and Zelensky signed, on the other hand, in Ukraine, mentioned the UN charter, but emphasized the need for peace. And this shows a shift on the Ukrainian side. It wasn't that long ago that Ukraine was insisting that every last man, every last inch of territory needs to be conceded, and only then would there be peace negotiations. That has shifted. It's shifted under American instructions. So clearly, it's not impossible to imagine some sort of deal at some point in the not too distant future. On the other hand, it isn't that difficult to imagine this war going on and on and on. And so, although, I can speculate, and I have, about the possibility of Russia taking this town or that town while the fighting season lasts, that really is up to autumn, so it's not that much longer. But having done that, then turning its attention to the south and the possibility of cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea. But I have to say that if that was going to be achieved, at least at the present rate of advance, that would take an awful long time, perhaps into the next decade. So who knows? This war could be finished through peace negotiations, or it could simply drag on and on and on. Meanwhile, what America seems to be banking on, though, is regime change in Russia. I don't think anyone sees a military defeat for either side. I've heard talk of Ukraine just about to collapse. I'm not convinced. But equally, if you look at this Kursk offensive, of course, it's produced you the Western media, which are coming out with the opposite line, that the Putin regime, its days are numbered. Kursk shows that Putin is just about to fall. I'm not convinced of that, although we shouldn't discount it as a possibility. It just seems to me that we're not in a position to judge. And if there was going to be such a change, I think we'd need to see the sort of telltale signs of movement away from Putin, splits in the regime, splits in the army, and other than Wagner, we don't seem to have any evidence towards such a thesis whatsoever. My guess, for what it's worth, is that while Trump's quite capable of saying one thing, he's also quite capable within 48 hours of doing the exact opposite. So the idea that Trump puts over, about him being the peacemaker and under his watch, well, yeah, but there were some near runs, weren't there, of where he nearly gave the go ahead. And so all I would say is that what the Democrats and Republicans are united on is stopping the rise of China. And I think that what you can then have is, how do you stop the rise of China? One way, for example, is to confront Russia, get it involved in what it's been a quagmire in Ukraine. Another one might conceivably be, I don't know, turn it around, turn Russia around, and it becomes a US ally. But if you do that, you have to give them massive concessions. And whatever Trump thinks, well, what then happens to American jobs? If Russia's allowed to develop and join, for example, the World Trade Organization or whatever. So I don't know is the long and the short, why the particular differences are. But I think when it comes to fundamentals, they're united. And so I could easily imagine, if there was a Trump presidency, Trump's presidency continuing to supply loads of arms to Ukraine. It's conceivable. On the other hand, so expressing my ignorance. But I also suspect that no one actually knows. I don't think there is an answer, because it will depend on all, a whole number of different factors, not least, what happens on the battlefield. It's not going to be irrelevant. I was also going to comment on at least the liberal media going big on Kamala Harris, which isn't a surprise, but they ain't half going for it. So they are really desperate for Trump not to win. But again, it's an open question. Who the hell knows? Just going back, I sort of broadly agree with Mike. When I look at Russia, Ukraine, world politics, I personally don't go, oh, Ukraine is on the verge of falling. I just don't see that. You might as well just look at, what's happened in Kursk and conclude that Russia's just about to collapse. I don't read it that way either. And I don't really agree that you can't hold three possibilities in the air at the same time. You can gain territory in order to negotiate. I don't see why that's incompatible with, dealing a propaganda blow against the regime in Moscow. Best troops, yes, deployed. That's certainly true. But you're not going to be using your motorized, your motorized armor in trenches. And what seems to be happening at the moment is both sides seem to be digging trenches. So yeah, the front is fluid at the moment, but they're not going to keep their tanks in Kursk. They're not going to keep their mechanized brigades in Kursk. You withdraw them and you put troops in to guard the trenches. So different regiments, different, brigades. So they're not trapped in Kursk. They can be redeployed. I don't see that as a particular problem. Maybe they were aiming for the Kursk nuclear power station, or at least, as you were saying, Paul, into artillery range of it to hold a gun to Putin's head. Maybe. I mean, it's perfectly valid piece of speculation, but it is speculation. I've got no clue, but my guess would be, for what it's worth, and it ain't worth very much, my guess is that they were as surprised as I was, and I suspect Putin was, and everyone else was, how quick their progress was. I mean, the reports I've read is that they do some shelling of Russian trench formations. They send sappers in, and then they send tanks in, and they get through. I'm just amazed that they got through, and then they find themselves in a situation where they got territory in front of them. So again, I don't know, but we shall see. I mean, I don't know of any evidence of saying this was the strategic aim of this particular operation. Okay, so my basic thesis is here that you asked, Paul, Ukraine can't defeat Russia. Yes, that's absolutely right. It cannot defeat Russia, obviously, because it's a huge country. It's not going to go to Moscow. It cannot defeat them in Ukraine. That is true. But I think it's also true the other way around, that Russia so far, all the evidence is that Russia cannot defeat Ukraine. And, maybe at the beginning, I don't want to give advice to anybody, but maybe if they sent more troops and they were better prepared in phase one, they could get all the way to Kiev. Maybe they could have surrounded it. Maybe they could have forced a surrender of Zelensky and he wouldn't have flown off some. Maybe. But now, no, Russia cannot defeat, doesn't show any evidence of defeating Ukraine. And the idea that Ukraine's about to run out of people. Well, they've just introduced, haven't they, conscription for 25-year-olds. What the hell are these young people not in the army for? If the country's under such dire threat, you mobilize everybody. You mobilize old gits like me, but you also mobilize younger people. You also would mobilize women. There's no evidence of that. So I don't see sort of panic on the Ukrainian side, and precisely as Mike argued. Meanwhile, what you've got is massive amounts of US arms, not just shells, but everything else. Now, I don't think myself that F-16s supplied by Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and whoever are going to tip any balance. I've always been very skeptical about that, but I do think that precisely the economic and military backing of the United States, the intelligence of the United States, the satellites of the United States, that is a factor we need to put in. So this isn't little Ukraine versus big bully Russia. This is a proxy war with NATO. Exactly. And so if we set a war between NATO, albeit through a proxy, then things, I think, look a lot different. And precisely, I don't expect any time soon. But if you look at this Kursk incursion, it's a morale question. And, all you need to do is pick up your Clausewitz on war or any other decent study on war, and they will tell you it isn't just numbers. It's not just bullets that, decide battles, let alone wars. It's morale. And, anyone who tells me that morale at the moment in Russia is sky high is kidding themselves. The morale, in Putin's circle is sky high. On the other hand, I would suspect that amongst Ukrainian nationalists, at last they're saying we've delivered a blow to the Russian bear, and the morale of their troops will be high as a result of it. Just as with the, that's why I thought I couldn't resist introducing it with the, the Wagner rebellion, that Ukrainian morale would have been boosted by that. And so the idea that, oh, well, Putin sorted that out after a month, it shows you to me how vulnerable the Putin regime is. I mean, what sort of regime is it? It's a regime that I would say fixes presidential elections, fixes other elections, is a regime that isn't deeply rooted in Russia. Remember Putin and his lecture to the oligarchs, the so-called oligarchs: you keep your nose out of politics. Look what happened to Gordievsky. So this isn't a regime with deep roots. It is a FSB regime, military regime, if you want. But even then, so I think it is vulnerable. I don't know. It could last. On the other hand, I think we'd see signs of it if it was going to crack, and I don't see those signs at the moment. But I think the Kursk incursion is precisely a morale boost to the Ukrainian side, but crucially, a morale drop for the Russian side. Now, the Financial Times assures me that Western advisors knew nothing about it. I shrug my shoulders and go, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But I don't believe it. But I don't know. But that to me would be what they were saying. Well, why don't we do this? We're on the back foot in the Donbass. Why don't we strike them in the soft underbelly, where they weren't expecting it? Clearly they weren't. Yeah, I mean, just on Europe, I mean, all you need to say is what Mike said, is it's Nord Stream and the Ukraine war. And I mean, Europe is a sort of Ruritanian setup, isn't it? With vetoes by any particular country. There's no way it can work under its present structure as anything that can coordinate against the United States. But I would say that, with the Ukraine war, Germany has paid the biggest price. It's not the biggest arms supplier. There's no doubt about that. That's the United States. But the country that's, undergone the greatest self-sacrifice, or the greatest self-sacrifice has been imposed upon it, is Germany. It's been, denied cheap Russian gas, which an awful lot of its industry, in terms of its competitiveness, depends on. So my own take on it is that Europe has suffered, Germany in particular has suffered. But just on Paul's basic thesis, look, no one's suggesting that NATO is relying on Ukrainian troops to sort of copy, but this time successfully, Napoleon and march all the way to Moscow and take Moscow and overthrow the Putin regime. No one's suggesting that. What is being suggested is that Russia doesn't win in Ukraine. And therefore, as a result of that, there's a crisis of regime in Moscow. That's what's being suggested, that in terms of the elite, there's a split. And it's not just a question of Putin. Putin is mortal, you know, everyone's going to die. So he's going to go at some point. But is the regime going to continue, or is it going to split? And I suspect that the calculation is that at some point it will split. Now, that could be wrong. You might have no split in the regime. But at the moment, there's no sign, as far as I can see, that Russia can turn around and say, oh, we're within sight of achieving our goals. We're going to win in Ukraine. I think, you know, I mean, I put forward the argument that it looks like to me that Russia can't defeat Ukraine and Ukraine can't defeat Russia. And therefore, you know, what regime would you expect to crack? And I would expect cracks to start in Moscow, but that could be wrong. And just on numbers and all the rest of it, I think this is too simple. You know, so Ukraine was always bound to lose. On that basis, the Mujahideen in you know, Afghanistan were always going to lose. Wars aren't straightforward numbers or GDP or something like that.